right, I'd like to welcome you all this afternoon. Today we're going to study Psalm 129. As we continue through the Songs of Ascent, we're going to study Psalm 129 today, but remember that the Songs of Ascents were psalms so subtitled where Israelite pilgrims sung on their annual pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. Remember, we said up to Jerusalem is what people would say because Jerusalem was built in the mountains and the hills, and to get there you had to go up the road. And that's where they went, up to Jerusalem, as they sang these songs. Last time I told you that the Songs of Ascent, which are Psalms 120 through 134, are grouped into 5 triads, 5 groups of 3 psalms each. The first psalm in each triad is an illustration of trouble. The second psalm is in every triad is an illustration of trust, and the third psalm in each triad is an illustration of triumph. So you can just count through there: 120, 123, 126, 129, that sort of thing. It's going to be a psalm of trouble. And then you can do the same thing with the number 2 psalm in each triad, 121, 124, like that. All right. The triad in which Psalm 129 falls contains Psalm 129, 130, and 131. That makes Psalm 129 a psalm illustrating trouble. It's the first in the triad. The classification of Psalm 129 by type is a praise psalm. It's actually a praise psalm. It's inferred praise. It actually doesn't come out and praise God, but it's inferred by the things that it says. The metaphors used in this psalm are based on agriculture. It happens a lot with an agricultural community. Verses 1 through 4, we've got 8 verses we're talking about, and verses 1 through 4 are the image of plowing dominates, verses 1 through 4. Verses 5 through 8, the image of harvesting stands out. So we've got those 2 main things, plowing and harvesting. Okay, let's look at the psalm. Verse 1 through 4 recalls Israel's history of oppression. We're going to go through some of that so you'll understand what I'm talking about. Let's look at verses 1 through 2, 1 and 2. Let me read those for you. Psalm 129. They have greatly oppressed me from my youth. Let Israel say, they have greatly oppressed me from my youth, but they have not gained the victory over me. They greatly oppressed me from my youth. The me of this verse, they greatly oppressed me. The me of this verse is Israel. We can see this from the second half of the psalm where he says, let Israel say. It says, let Israel say, they have greatly oppressed me. So Israel is talking and referring to me. So we're talking about Israel. So we're talking about Israel. Furthermore, we're talking about the period of time from their youth, the early days of their existence as a nation, actually existence of a nation in Egypt, up until the time of the Assyrian captivity or maybe even the Babylonian exile. So that's the period of time of their youth that we're talking about, from their youth. Obviously, they're not going to be a youth when we're talking about the Babylonian invasion, but we're talking about the period of time from their youth. That's what it said. They have greatly oppressed me from my youth. So you start from the youth, time of their youth, and move forward. If you recall, Joseph was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, and he eventually ended up as the number 2 man ruling all of Egypt. He's the number 2 guy. You can look at Genesis 41:41 to see that. I'm going to be talking in summary form here, so I may give you some verses. So if you want to write them down, you can, but you probably know where they are. As a result of Jacob's family, as a result of famine, actually, Jacob's family went to Egypt, and they were received by Joseph. Actually, they were saved from starvation by Joseph. They didn't realize they were dealing with Joseph at the beginning, but it turns out God put Joseph out there ahead of them so he would be there when they got there. Because we're talking about the family that's eventually going to become the nation of Israel. When Jacob went to Egypt, there were 70 people. They're mentioned as the sons of Israel in Exodus 1, verses 1 through 5. And remember, Israel is the spiritual name for Jacob. So they were talked there in Exodus 1, 1 through 5 as the sons of Israel, but almost in the very next breath, they're talking about the children of the sons of Jacob. So with the coming of the new king, so they went to Egypt. Joseph took them in, and they were there doing the things that they did. You can read the Bible and see what they were doing. But eventually, a new king comes to town. And this king did not know Joseph, so he put Joseph's people, it's called Joseph's people, he's talking about the family of Jacob, put his people into slavery. You can look at Exodus 1, verses 9 and 11 to see that. So this is the beginning of the oppression mentioned in Psalm 129:1. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. You've heard that before. It's Exodus 1, verse 12. They became too numerous, so they unsuccessfully tried to kill the newborn baby boys. That's Exodus 1:16. They actually talked to the midwives, say when you're delivering a baby, if it's a boy, we want you to kill him. But the midwives couldn't bring themselves to do that. So it's an unsuccessful attempt to kill the baby boys. Then later they tried to drown them in the river. That's mentioned in Exodus 1:22. All this can be found in Exodus chapter 1. If you want to read through it, it's an interesting story. It's not a story, it's an account. All of the foregoing I just told you that. They were told to drown the baby boys, and Moses was one of the boys that was saved. They were able to save some of the boys, and Moses happened to be one of those that was saved. So you know about Moses, you know who he was, you know what he became, you know the story of his life as well. So all the foregoing of that stuff that I just told you about can be found in Exodus 1. When they left Egypt, you remember God got with Moses and he sent him in there to take his people out. And when you know the story of the plagues and all that. When they left Egypt, they had grown. They were there for 400 years under slavery. They lived there 400 years in slavery. And they grew from a family of 70 to 3 million. 3 million people left Israel. Now we're talking about round numbers. I'm not sure that there's nothing in the Bible to support that. There might be some historical documents to look at, but even you just could probably put a pen to paper and calculate it and get pretty close to 3 million. In addition to all that, from the early days of their youth, they encountered the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom. We talked about that. We studied the book of Hosea. They encountered the Babylonian exile of the southern kingdom. That happened 150 years or so after the Assyrian captivity. You had the northern kingdom that was taken into captivity and deported first, and then the southern kingdom was taken over by Babylon 150 years later. Then they encountered the Romans. I suppose the time in Egypt and the time under the Romans could be considered as bookends for purposes of this psalm, but there was so much more. So we're going to measure from, we're going to talk about their, how do you put it? We talked about they were greatly oppressed from their youth. Their youth was measured from their time in Egypt, because prior to that time when they were not a nation, when they went into captivity, they were a people, 70 people actually. When they went into slavery, when they came out, they were a nation. They were 3 million people. And that is when this time is talking about from their youth. It's from their time in Egypt. So you can take that time from their youth to whatever time covers the Psalms. We'll just say the Babylonian exile. That's when Jerusalem's destroyed and the temple's destroyed. And just call that the bookends for this, the time that we're talking about in this psalm. Everything that happened in between there is the time when they were greatly oppressed. But in addition to that, within the bookends, you had in 722 BC, you had the Assyrian captivity. Assyrians captured and deported the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom into the nations. In 586, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. In 169 BC, so we're working up to the time when the Romans tore up Jerusalem. In 169 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes polluted the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar of the temple and began a bloodbath persecution of the Jews. So it's starting to sound like they were greatly oppressed during this time from their youth. In 70 AD, the Romans besieged Jerusalem and killed 1 million Jews and deported 97,000 Jews into the world slave market. This is oppression of a people on a scale, on an unimaginable scale. If you get outside of the bookends, it's just as bad. Think about this, 399 AD, so that's 400 years after Christ, roughly. Constantine, who nationalized Christianity, issued edicts against the Jews. In 439, there were more edicts against the Jews, 439 AD. In 630 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius allowed priests and monks to massacre Jews. If you go even into World War II with Hitler carrying out genocide against the Jews, killing millions of Jews. So that takes us to verse 2. That's just verse 1. So you've got the bookends. You've got everything for this psalm where they are greatly oppressed from their youth up until whatever time these psalms are talking about, whatever time they're singing about going up to Jerusalem. But then from our perspective, what happened to them afterwards? That's some of the things I just mentioned. They're a people that has been tormented and oppressed beyond imagination. All right, verse 2 says this. They have greatly oppressed me. The end of verse 1 into verse 2 says, let Israel say, they have greatly oppressed me from my youth, but they have not gained the victory over me. They've oppressed me greatly for my youth, but I'm still here. They have not gained victory over me. We were oppressed, but they have not gained victory over us. Isaiah 10, we're not going to cover that, but that contains the doctrine of the remnant. Isaiah gets credit for the development of the doctrine of the remnant. You can read through it. It's interesting. It basically says there's a promise there It says they will never be completely destroyed. There will always be a remnant. And it's a good thing. If you look at all the ways they've been persecuted over the centuries, any other peoples would be gone. But we have the doctrine of the remnant for them to live by. But the real problem comes, promise comes with the Abrahamic covenant. Let's look at Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3 says this. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you," listen to this, here's the covenant. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all people on earth will be blessed through you." And verse 3 is the verse I want to focus on right now. "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." Nations who have harbored and protected the Jews, Israel, have prospered. The United States is one of them. We're one of the few left. Those who have persecuted them and turned against them have eventually paid the price. Germany didn't come out too well in World War II, if you recall, when they persecuted the Jews. Let's look at verse 3. Verse 3 says, "So he said, they have greatly oppressed me from my youth, but they have not gained the victory over me." They had the Abrahamic covenant. They had the doctrine of the remnant. They are still here. There's probably more Jews today alive on planet Earth than there have ever been. All right, verse 3 says this. "Plowmen have plowed my back and made their furrows long." You know what a furrow is? You run a plow across the land. It cuts the ground, breaks the ground up so you can plant whatever crop you're going to plant. And it's called a furrow. It cuts a furrow in the ground. And he says here, the plowmen have plowed my back and made their furrows long. That doesn't sound too good. We get a picture here in our minds of being worked at the plow like animals. Human beings, specifically the Jews, being worked at the plow like animals, having their backs plowed by a whip. What more could this sound like except that which I've already told you about the nations persecuting Israel. They have been oppressed, and now he's using a metaphor of a plow. They've been plowed. They've been run like animals. They've been whipped like animals to do work. All right, verse 4. But it says in verse 4, "The Lord is righteous. He has cut me free from the cords of the wicked." But there's always a but with God. God is righteous, and he has cut those cords from the plowman. He has cut those cords of servitude and enslavement because he is righteous. That's what that says. How can all of this be explained? All of this anti-Semitism, but also the promise of protection for Israel. How do you explain all that? Satan loathes and detests Israel because it is the one nation over which he has no direct authority. It is the one nation created directly by the authority of God. He named Israel. He created Israel himself. All other nations came from Adam's dominion over the earth. Every nation has a satanic prince ruling over it except for Israel. Israel does not have one. God has put the archangel Michael, the head of the armies of heaven, over Israel. So Satan has tried to rid himself of Israel to no avail. their protection is promised even to the remnant. All right, let's look at verse 4. Let me read verse 4 again. It says, "But the Lord is righteous. He hath cut me free from the cords of the wicked." God is righteous. He has cut me free from the bonds of slavery, from the bonds of oppression. All right. Verses 5 through 8 are a series of imprecations, a series of curses for those who persecute Israel. We're going to run through these rather quickly, but let's look at verse 5. Verse 5 says, "May all who hate Zion be turned back in shame." The psalmist wants their enemies to be shamed and turned back. He doesn't want to just turn them back. He wants them to be humiliated when they're turned back. As before, the psalmist is expecting deliverance. He prays to God, expecting deliverance. You know, we never know under God's will what his plans are, but through the experience with God, they feel like they can expect. They know they can pray to God. They know he will hear them, and they're expecting deliverance. All right, let's look at verse 6. Verse 6 says, "May they be like grass on the roof." Now, we're going to think about this in a minute. "May they be like grass on the roof, which withers before it can grow." The grass seed is the metaphor for the enemy. It blows onto the roof and quickly sprouts, but there's not enough moisture, not really enough dirt up there, so it quickly withers. This also has to do with uprooting or pulling up by the roots. If you look at the Hebrew, some of these verses are really bound to the Hebrew to completely understand it, but they're things that we really don't have to understand from the perspective of the actual Hebrew. But this is metaphor for grass blowing up on the roof where there's insufficient moisture, insufficient dirt, insufficient nutrients for whatever, and the grass quickly sprouts up and then it dies back. The psalmist may be requesting of God that the enemies wither up before they are able to pull out their sword again in military conquest. And that part, pulling out their sword, goes back to the actual Hebrew. Could have to do with pulling grass up by the roots or uprooting it. So he would be saying he wants this withering of the enemies before they can uproot or pull out their sword in another military conflict. All right, let's look at verse 7. "A reaper cannot fill his hands with it." I suppose that's grass and harvest of crops. "A reaper cannot fill his hands with it, nor one who gathers fill his arms." There's nothing to pick up. Normally, abundant harvest is a time of celebration. The psalmist explains that with the withering grass, there will be nothing to harvest. After the work of God against those who hate Zion, which is their enemies, they said call those who hate Zion in verse 4, it means their enemies, the remaining threat will be reduced to nothing more than a handful. The absence of sufficient yield for the harvest will be cause for celebration in the community. It's a metaphor. Remember, it's a metaphor for their enemies. The absence of sufficient yield for the harvest will be cause for the celebrations in the community. There will be nothing left to fight against. All right, verse 8, and then we'll be through. Verse 8 says this: "May those who pass by not say to them, 'The blessing of the Lord be on you. We bless you in the name of the Lord.'" May those who pass by not say to them, the blessing of the Lord. They're not going to say this. They're not going to say this. The blessing of the Lord be on you. We bless you in the name of the Lord. Once God has exacted his punishment upon their enemies, there will be nothing to harvest. Therefore, there will be no passers-by to receive any greeting. The ways of their enemies have been thwarted by their righteous God, Yahweh. All right, that's all I have for you. Thanks for listening.